Okay, so if you're a React developer, you know this feeling. You're kicking off a brand new project, and right away, that big nagging question pops into your head. Which state management library am I going to use? Redux? Zoostand? Jotai? The list goes on, and it feels like a super high-stakes decision.
And this is the question, right? It's the one that just seems to take over every conversation on Twitter, on Reddit, and team meetings. It's kind of the million-dollar question in the React world. And everybody has a strong opinion, and you're sitting there thinking, if I pick the wrong one, I could be setting this project up for failure from day one.
But here's the thing. What if that's the wrong question entirely? In her fantastic article, Nadia Makarevich just drops this bombshell. For the most part, you don't need any of them. Okay, whoa. Let's really dig into that, because that one idea completely changes how we should be looking at this whole problem.
So the whole idea here is that, for years, we've just been throwing everything into this giant messy bucket we call state. But it's not one single monolithic monster. It's actually four totally separate, much smaller problems. And once you start to see them that way, you realize there are already perfect, specialized tools to solve each one. All right, first up, remote state. This is all the data that doesn't live in your app. It's out there on a server somewhere. You know, user data, a list of products, basically anything you have to fetch over the network from an API. This is usually the trickiest part of our apps. We've got to worry about fetching, caching, loading spinners, error messages, the works. And here's the key. For this kind of state, you don't really want a generic state library. You want a specialized data fetching library. And the absolute gold standard here is TanStack Query. I mean, this thing is built specifically for this. It handles all that gnarly stuff, caching, getting rid of duplicate requests, retrying failed fetches. It just handles it all for you, automatically. This one tool can wipe out a massive percentage of the code you used to write in something like Redux. Okay, next on the list, URL state. This is all that stuff you see in the browser's address bar after the question mark. Think about things like which filter is on, which tab is active, or what you just typed into the search bar. Trying to keep your UI perfectly in sync with that URL, it can be shockingly painful to get right. It's a classic source of bugs. And that's where a library like Nukes comes in. Oh man, this thing is brilliant. It makes dealing with URL state feel as easy as using a basic useState hook. You just use its useQuery state hook, and poof, all that messy synchronization with a URL is handled for you. It is an absolute game changer for this specific problem.
All right, number 3, local state. And this one is the easiest of them all. This is just data that a single component needs to do its job, and that's it. It doesn't need to be shared with anyone. We're talking about simple stuff like, is this modal window open or closed? Is this drop-down menu visible?
And guess what? The perfect solution is already built right into React. It's just useState. That's all you need. You know, back in the day, there was this mindset of put everything in Redux, and we made this stuff way more complicated than it needed to be. For local state, the simplest tool is by far the best tool. No library required.
Now this right here, changes everything. When you look at it this way, you see that if you use a tool like TanStack Query for your remote data and Nux for your URL state, you've already solved something like 90% of what we used to call state management. That huge, scary problem we started with, it just shrank down to this tiny little 10% slice.
So that brings us to the final 10%, the tricky bit, shared state. This is the classic problem, right? You've got components in totally different parts of your app that need to know about the same piece of information. Like a theme switcher in your settings page needs to tell the header to change color. So React itself gives us a couple of tools for this out of the box. First, there's prop drilling, where you just pass data down through component after component. It works, but it gets to be a real nightmare fast. Then there's React Context, which on the surface looks like the perfect answer. You can just teleport data from a provider straight to where it's needed, skipping all the components in between. It looks so clean.
But yeah, there's always a but, isn't there? As your application gets bigger, you end up in what's known as provider hell. You start wrapping your app in a theme provider, and then an auth provider, and then a sidebar provider, and pretty soon, your main app file is this horrifying, deeply nested pyramid of code that's impossible to follow. And honestly, that's not even the worst part. There's a huge, hidden performance trap. With context, when any piece of data in the provider changes, every single component that uses that context re-renders. So if your user object and your theme are in the same context, and you just change the theme from light to dark, your user profile component might re-render for no reason at all. It can get really slow really fast. So, now, and only now, once you've solved the other 90% and you see that React context is starting to creak under the load, that's when you can finally start thinking about an external library. And now we have a very clear, very specific mission. Find a tool that solves shared state better than context does.
And Nadia gives us this really smart framework for how to pick one. First, it's got to be simple. We're only solving 10% of the problem. We don't need some massive, complex new system. Second, it has to directly fix context's biggest flaws. No more provider hell, and it has to be smart about re-renders. And of course, it should feel natural to use with React hooks and be a well-supported library.
So when you measure some of the big names against that simplicity rule, you start to see a clear picture. Old school Redux, way too much boilerplate. Things like MobX or Jotai or XState, they're super powerful for sure, but they make you learn whole new concepts like observables or atoms. They kind of fail the simplicity test. But one library, one really stands out.
And this is why, for Nadia, Zustand just wins. It absolutely nails what we're looking for. You can get a global store up and running in like 3 lines of code. There are no providers, so provider hell is impossible. And the best part, it's smart about re-renders right out of the box. Components only update if the specific slice of state they actually care about has changed. It's just simple and effective.
But, and this is super important, this doesn't mean you should just blindly pick Zustand for everything. The right tool always depends on the job. If you're on a huge team that needs a very strict structure and really advanced debugging tools, something like Redux Toolkit might actually be a better fit. If you're building something as incredibly complex as, say, the Figma editor, then the state machine model from XState is probably exactly what you need.
Okay, let's put this all together. Let's build your state management playbook for 2025. This is your quick guide to doing this the smart way.
It's a simple 4-step process. Seriously, this is it. Number 1, for any data coming from a server, use TanStack Query. Number 2, for anything you store in the URL, use nukes. Number 3, for state that lives and dies in one component, just use uState. And number 4, the last resort, for that little bit of shared state that's left, start with React context. And only when that starts to cause problems, you reach for a tiny library like Zustand.
And the craziest part, if you follow that playbook, you realize something amazing. You can solve 90% of all your state management issues without ever installing a classic state management library. The problem we've been agonizing over for years, it just kind of dissolves.
And that's how we get to the real takeaway here. We need to completely change the question we ask ourselves at the start of a project. We should stop asking which library is the best. The much better question is, what kind of state am I dealing with right now, and what's most important for this project? If you can answer those questions, you'll find the right tool for the job every single time.